So to start us off, Craig, how about you give us just a brief intro of what we're seeing in the fraud landscape with regards to Treasury?
Well, Isaac, thanks. It's good to be here. The level of fraud has escalated dramatically to the point where crime does pay. It's grown from simple check fraud forgeries to business email compromise, spoofing people, getting them to send payments or change master records, to very significant system-level hacks. So payments that were fraud levels that were in the $1,500, $1,700 range. Now we're seeing an average of $130,000 an incident of business email compromise in the U.S., according to some fairly recent FBI statistics. And then when we look at some of these cases of system-level fraud, it's massive. It's some of these are well over $1 million. We've seen some instances of almost $1 billion of messages being sent to enact transfers, with one case of $81 million being lost and still not recovered several years fast forward. Very significant. So the escalation has grown dramatically. Crime does pay. It's been paying far better than before, and we're seeing a higher caliber of criminals. They're more organized. They're crime rings. They're even state actors pulling massive amounts of money out. So since crime does pay, they're doing it more, and they're leveraging automation, which is hitting almost everyone.
So you keep bringing up this point that crime does pay. What do you think is causing that escalation?
Yeah, we hit that phrase, crime does pay, like a gong, and part of that is because the payoff is massive, and the reason it's massive is the core of your question. It's paying off because people, and criminals in particular, are leveraging technology. So they're leveraging technology to gain information and insight on companies. They're no longer having to call or talk to an individual person. They're using bots, information to gather tremendous amount of information to surveil companies and individuals in those companies. So they're able to leverage their activities with automation. They're no longer the lazy smash and grab criminal. They're the lazy but automated criminal who gathers better information and can attack more companies all at once.
So why is Treasury in particular being targeted?
Some years ago they asked Willie Sutton why he robbed banks, because that's where the money is. Well, there's money to be had in different areas. We're pretty familiar with the data breaches, and why do people steal confidential personal information is because they can sell it. Well, that's a step removed from getting cash, right? You have to get it, you have to sell it. Each of those represents, to some extent, a point of exposure of getting caught. To the extent that you can steal money directly, you don't have to convert data into sales and have a whole sales arm. You get money, take it out, you move it out of the banking system, and you have the money. So that's a key reason why Treasury is targeted, because they're finding, if they invest enough time, enough energy, they're able to break through some of the layers of defenses that these groups have. And it doesn't have to be just Treasury. It can be AP, it can be payroll, it can be different areas. This is significant. The threat level has increased greatly. It's like the war footing has gone up so much, and the criminals have had an advantage and have an advantage right now. The defenses need to increase to a level that it provides that type of protection.
So as we look at the past 1 to 2 years, and the level of fraud activity that we've seen, what are some types of fraud that you have seen gain in frequency over the time frame?
Yeah, so a couple of them. The business email compromise, that's also known as imposter fraud or CEO fraud. This is the concept where you convince someone to make a payment. It could be because it's urgent. You think the message is coming from the CFO, the CEO, or someone important. There's an element of it's got to be confidential, and you've got to do it quickly. This has skyrocketed, and I'll just go back a few years. It was becoming very prevalent. Companies were losing money. It was talked about in the Treasury press very significantly, and we saw an actual increase in the following year. Not only an increase in attempts from 87% to 89% of companies experiencing these types of attacks, but a greater increase in those that had suffered a loss. And this is not because they weren't prepared, it's because those attacks improved in their efficacy. People were more convincing and more compelling. And we could give you lots of examples. If someone stopped one, there was something fishy, and then several months later, they didn't catch it, and the money went out the door, they lost it and they lost their jobs.
So with regards to BEC and imposter fraud, what do you think the best defense mechanism is for a corporate treasurer?
Yeah, so when we think about these methods of convincing people to change records or to send money, the best defense requires at least two things. One is a clear process that requires in-system validation of any changes or requests. Do not violate your process of having multiple people approve things, or the normal approval process gets circumvented because, someone's hair is on fire. The CEO wants this. Take the time. If you get yelled at because you delayed a payment slightly because someone was trying to go around the controls, you can rest comfortably knowing you did the right thing to protect the organization. Even if you ended up getting in trouble for that, that is the right thing. Make sure the process is not violated. Secondly, the other piece has to do with the idea of out-of-band authentication. So if you don't have all of your approvals coming through a system where each party who's requesting, validating, approving, releasing, if those are not coming through the system, you need to make sure that there's some type of out-of-band authentication. What I mean by that is if you're an AP manager, you're receiving communication from one of your biggest vendors that you're making payments with, and they're talking for a month. This is from an actual example. They're communicating back and forth via email. Then they say, yeah, we're changing our banking information. Here's the information. You need to validate that through a separate path. So that example of someone making that change violates both things. One, a channel can be compromised. You need another channel to confirm the setup or the change of vendor master information or payment master information. And two, you need to make sure you're following the rules that you have established. So both of those together are vital.
How do you see the issue of security training and practitioner training affecting the levels of fraud that we're seeing?
So there's two different stories with this, and I think it's really worth pointing out. Everyone recognizes that the level of fraud has increased. And it's one thing to recognize that fraud has increased, but you need to do something to counter that. And it's not just put a better firewall in place. Those are important. There's a number of layers of security that have to be put in place. And it has to do with the IT component. It also has to do with the human element. People need to understand what's going on because they can override systems for sure. So the idea that there's training that needs to take place is catching on. It's required if you have PCI. Anything related to the card process requires that you have training each year. If you use SWIFT, if you're a corporate practitioner of SWIFT, they have a program that requires annual training each year. So a couple things we see here is, in a recent survey, we calibrated how many banks and how many corporations had a regular annual training. And we further asked, if you have that annual training, do you have a testing component to that? Now the banks, almost all banks, 97% of banks have annual training for their employees related to fraud, desktop hygiene, all these different areas, including payment concerns. So almost all of them do that. And a very large percentage of them have a testing component to them, so much so to the extent that greater than 90% of banks do this training and have testing. On the corporation side, it's a very different story. Only 39% have required annual training for security. And 2/3 of those have a testing component, which means 26% train and test on an annual basis. I think we can all say this is an important topic. It's not just to check the box, yeah, you did the training, but check the box, we did the training, and people are paying attention and they understand it at a certain level. If they don't get it at a certain level, there's a review function for that. This idea of training is good. You need to have that training, be introduced to the new situations that are emerging, the new approaches, how successes have occurred, how things have been prevented, these different attack vectors that are being used. People have to understand that. Then there's an element of knowing that and then how to prevent it. So that's a big gap.
So would you say that the corporate treasury's security training or lack thereof is one of the biggest exposures that they currently have?
That is definitely one of the top areas because the human element is so important, and it's not being done in 3/4 of organizations at the level that I think everyone would say, based on how concerned corporates identify their concern level, They're very concerned about it, and yet they're not following through on all these yet. We do expect that to change and to grow, but that's a significant gap. Issues of, is our firewall up to date? Are we making sure people are getting trained on phishing? That's happening more. That's driven more from an IT. But from the treasurer's perspective, the training and the follow-through on those items is lagging, and that's where the exposure is.
So shifting gears real quick, I know we've just gone through a couple examples of BEC imposter fraud and some of the security training that we're seeing in the space, but I wanted to touch on a new fraud type that we saw come to the forefront in 2017, and that's ransomware. Can you give us a brief overview of what ransomware is?
Yeah, ransomware leverages technology for encryption. Encryption is great because you can lock up your data. If people gain access to the drive, they can't see the data because it's encrypted. That's a beautiful use of encryption. Ransomware is using that technology to encrypt someone else's data so they don't have access to their key information anymore.
How would you steal someone else's data?
Well, stealing data would be you gain access to the entity and you exfiltrate the data. You transfer it off, you gain information where it is, and you pull it off, using high-speed internet connections, either all at once or over time, so you don't hit some thresholds. You pull that data off over time.
So why was the corporate landscape, when we remember the Wannacry epidemic that hit early in 2017, why was the Treasury space so unprepared for this?
The Wannacry situation was one type of ransomware where they were able to hit a number of companies, send that ransomware out to a number of places, get it installed, and then reap the reward of those companies, medical institutions, healthcare firms had to make payments to unlock their data. Sometimes they actually got their data back or unlocked, and other times they paid and didn't receive anything. Treasury isn't as prepared for the ransomware per se. Largely, Treasury is not focused on the IT component of security. And I think Treasury needs to be, in my mind, in our mind, how we think about it, has to be a superintendent of security. Now, that does not mean they know, the latest firewall issues, the exposures you might have with Wi-Fi in the building, people bringing their own personal Wi-Fi devices. They don't have to understand every single component across the board related to IT. But they need to understand all these points of attack and all these vulnerabilities because they have to protect the cash of the organization, the liquid assets of the organization. And these all represent areas that provide access to that. So they need to be aware of and understand that. And since that's an attack, they need to know how they can prevent it, detect it, and mitigate it. So, having your data backed up is one method of doing that. Your disaster recovery, your business recovery process can usually help that. But it needs to be contemplated that these are attacks that can impact the organization, can impact Treasury, or more likely, they impact other parts of the operation.
So, and you just mentioned Treasury as being sort of the superintendent of security, especially where payments and assets are concerned. Is there any particular methodology that you would promote for Treasury as they structure a security framework or move forward with implementing stricter security practices?
Yeah, the reality is that there's going to be a chief information, a chief security officer of most companies, certainly of banks, and it's put out there that they're responsible for gathering all that. The different operational risks that exist are going to be in the organization. But being the superintendent, you can call it an agent of change if they're just an influencer, but they need to ask those questions and understand, not take we've got all this covered. That's not acceptable. That should not be acceptable to any treasurer to not know and to not have some of their key staff know how the organization is protecting penetration from the outside, management on if somebody gets inside the organization, how you detect anomalous behavior. So that superintendent or an agent of change means we have to protect our assets, and it's not just the cash in the bank, it's those access points that can impact the cash of the bank, that can impact the liquid assets of the organization. Those are things that can't be avoided. They're not, you can't say, well, that's IT's fault, that's AP's fault.
So when looking at the leading practices for Treasury security in the current day, there were a couple things that I wanted to get your opinion on, the first being multi-factor authentication. How do you see that as playing an enhanced role in the current environment?
Multi-factor authentication is required by a number of the different security control frameworks. And the reason why this is so important, it's just having additional layers. You have an ID password. Someone gets your ID and password, they can act like you in the system, and you can get blamed for it, and you can be compromised, right? They have their own, or they have two people's. They can enact transfers, approve them, delete information. So having another factor like an iris scan, an additional number changing PIN from a fob, a security fob, can provide an additional layer of security that's harder to compromise, because now you have to get the ID, the password, and a changing PIN, the actual fob, or you have to get their iris or have some way of spoofing the system for this additional factor. That's become vital for many, and you see that in the consumer side as well. Another factor might be a text confirm to your cell phone. Please respond with this PIN code. You have to have their phone too. So the different factors help protect it, especially when you're moving money. Information is important. Moving money is even more important.
There was one other security practice that has garnered a lot of media attention recently, and that's the issue of biometrics. I know that it's seen a lot of use on the banking side, but have you seen any of that on the corporate side yet, especially for Treasury?
We don't see too much biometrics, such as fingerprint, iris scan, the speed of which people type in their passwords, etc. But it's early in the process, and certainly banks and technology firms are looking at that, just other ways to enhance layers. As that time goes on, we add more layers of security. The ability to capture that is vital.
And a final note on that before we switch gears again, blockchain, again, has come to the forefront in 2017 and certainly looks to play a big role in 2018. And one of the big factors regarding blockchain is that security, or the impenetrability of the blockchain. So do you see that as playing an enhanced role in the coming years for security, or do you think that is just here 1 minute, gone the next?
So blockchain, this distributed ledger, means you're not dependent on a single area, let's say a single counterparty like a bank, whether it's a central bank or an individual bank, to validate a transaction. It's using algorithms and encryption. So there's some real benefit to that type of technology to allow for security of transactions. Now, if someone says there's impenetrability, that's certainly hype. Is anything impenetrable? We've seen some of the digital currencies that use different types of security and
Cryptography
encryption.
and such.
Yeah, they use types of cryptography, and there's been a number of massive breaches of places that house that information. So it's care has to be taken anywhere, whether it's you're storing gold in Fort Knox, you're protecting your AP file that's stored on a drive on your network where someone can change the banking information, or you're using some of the current tools. You need to make sure we're staying ahead. And so the ability to lock down using these massive crypto keys, is helpful.
So in looking ahead to the next 1 to 2 years, I know we just covered the prior 1 to 2 years and what's been seeing. What do you expect to see in terms of trends moving forward? Is there anything that you're looking out for in particular?
So trends on the attack side and trends on the defensive side. I think on the attack side, the criminals have gotten more and more organized. I mean, when you look at their attack vectors of stealing money directly through system fraud, different types of CEO, business email compromise fraud, they're getting very sophisticated on those. So I think we're going to see continued penetration of systems and attack of payment files and underlying data, because that's where you can get into someone's AP file, someone's treasury system, at the vendor master record information. You can change the settings, and then in the normal course of business, money will go out the door. This is a significant issue. Many companies are not organized with all their payments. If you ask them how many payments you, and these are for multinational companies, how many payment files do you send out?
Globally or every month or whatnot, right?
Yeah, throughout the organization. Give me an inventory of all the payment files and all the points of passing this data. They usually can't do it because they've acquired companies. There's different areas that create a file they upload to a portal. Some of them are going through a central system, but when they start looking for them, we have a good company who went through that process. They said we have 27. As they've gone through the process, they found over 50. And they continue to find more throughout the organization. I mean, they're a global organization. Something was set up a long time ago with a small organization, has continued to this day. Each of those represents not only a point of exposure, but a very inefficient process. Formats change. Multiple people are accessing the company's funds. Now, some accounts may not have as much money to draw, but they represent a point of exposure of reputation and certainly of money.
Okay. So, before we wrap up, I wanted to get your thoughts. If there was just one word of advice that you could give to a treasurer right now regarding security, what would that be?
Retire.
Other than retire, Greg?
No, I think that a little tongue-in-cheek with the retire, there's been a number of CFOs and treasurers who've had fraud happen to their organization. And they've gone through a situation where the CEO said, let's get this stuff locked down. And they didn't get it locked down well enough. And so they are forced to retire early. Now, I'm not trying to be dramatic about that. That's a terrible thing. It's, you get hit, the war, the balance of war here, the war with criminals has changed so dramatically. You need to retire or you need to build the right type of defense. And I think the idea of, I can't just say one thing, that's why I was a little tongue-in-cheek with the retire, is that you have to make sure you have an adequate, at least adequate security control framework. Whether you use something like NIST, or what IT runs, or you do something in the Treasury area, you have to have a framework that helps you systematically identify the points of exposure, your defense, and feedback on those. You also have to make sure you follow, not only have a framework, but you also follow the different security principles. We identify 12 key security principles, from the principle of least privilege, dual control segregation of duties, right, et cetera. You need to make sure you understand, and your group understands those principles and puts them out through the organization, because just understanding and having a framework doesn't necessarily mean that you apply all the principles. And corollary to all this is the training. People need to be upgraded just like your system needs to be upgraded. And what I mean by that is your computer should have all the latest security patches. Your network should have, should not be using default passwords. All of those basic things which we chuckle at and we say, how could they have not updated the security? How come the password was admin? And then they got hacked. Ha ha ha. We don't do that. That is, those updates to the systems are vital, and the updates to people is just or more vital. So this means keeping people current on what's going on, the attack vectors, defensive techniques and postures, and where those vulnerabilities lie is absolutely crucial. And this is not just make sure people flip on a video, but they have a way to learn and a way to be tested to make sure that they're picking up these items, because each person, particularly in Treasury, in AP, senior management, needs to understand what these things mean to the organization and how much money can go out the door. And even if not much money goes out the door, having a breach, not just of data, but a breach of your payment systems is highly embarrassing, very time-wasting, and can negatively impact the organization in many ways.
Thank you, Craig, so much for joining us today. That will conclude our podcast session.